glad to be able to be here this week. We are continuing this series, Living Proof, that Pastor Craig started at the beginning of the year. And we are examining the miracles and the signs that Jesus performed, specifically in the Gospel of John. And if you haven't been with us, I just want to just spend a few moments walking us through how John, the Gospel of John, is different from some of the other Gospels that we have, the other biographies of Jesus' life. The first three Gospels of the New Testament are called Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are written, they're typically called the Synoptic Gospels. It's kind of a theological term. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And those kind of chronologically walk through the life of Jesus. Some focus on the time before his birth, the genealogy of Jesus that Luke does a really good job sharing with us. And they kind of go chronologically throughout the call to ministry, him being young. There's a couple of accounts of him being young. But then even growing all of his sermons, all of his parables, his teachings, his miracles, the interactions with the disciples and the Pharisees, all of those are kind of chronologically outlined for us in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Gospel of John is different. John wrote this gospel decades after Jesus was crucified and resurrected. And John was reflecting back, and he thought to himself, I'm going to write a different kind of gospel because Matthew, Mark, and Luke did a great job. They kind of covered the story of Jesus. But John tells us the reason that his gospel exists is a little bit of a different reason. Towards the end of the gospel that he wrote, and what we now have labeled as John chapter 20, verse 21, he tells us that the thesis statement, the reason for this gospel, the Gospel of John, it's very specific. And he said, I've collected a whole bunch of different miracles and signs that Jesus performed. And these signs, there's a whole bunch of other signs and miracles that couldn't fit in this book, but I chose these 7 signs, these 7 miracles, so that you would know and believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Because the Messiah to come for the first century Jews would come and perform signs and miracles and wonders. And so John specifically pens this gospel pointing people to the signs and the miracles, but the signs and the miracles themselves were not what John wanted us to focus on. You see, when we're driving down the road and we see a stop sign, I would hope that when you're driving along, you see a stop sign, you don't just fix your attention on the sign. I hope that you recognize and realize that stop sign is actually telling us and it's propelling us to look to something else. And on a road, it's to the intersection where other cars might be coming to avoid danger. The signs and miracles of Jesus as outlined in the Gospel of John are the exact same. Yet there's some things that we examine and we look at and we're awed by these miracles and signs. But the signs actually point to something else, and they point to Jesus being the author and perfecter of our faith. They point to Jesus being the Alpha and the Omega, the one who created us, who knows us, who has restored us through his death and resurrection, and will come back to restore creation the way it was intended to be by our God. And so these signs and wonders that we look at, the miracles themselves are something to be examined and looked at, but they point to something different. And Jeff Surratt was actually here with us a couple of weeks into the series, and I love his definition of a miracle, that a miracle is something so extraordinary that can only be explained by God. And I also want us to remember, as we've looked through some of these different signs, specifically the first 2 that we looked at, the signs and wonders and miracles, specifically in the scriptures, are not for the super spiritual. They're not for the people that have been praying and fasting for miracles to happen. That oftentimes the signs and the miracles and wonders that we found in today's passage we're going to take a look at in John chapter 9 is one of these, is for people that were very confused about who Jesus was. That in some cases they weren't even believers yet, but yet Jesus chose to display his power through them. And here's what I love about the way that Jesus does miracles. The first 2 miracles that are exposed in the Gospel of John, it wasn't religious leaders, it wasn't royalty, it wasn't people that were esteemed in culture. There were the witnesses of the first 2 miracles that Jesus performed on this earth, but it was servants that actually witnessed and realized that they were miracles before anybody else had seen him. That tells me that God's heart is close to those who would seek him, not necessarily close to those who have an esteemed position in society. And so as we take a look at John chapter 9 today, we're going to take a look at a miracle, at an instance in the life of a man. And I wonder if many of us or any of us would be walking through a circumstance that this man may have been feeling when Jesus showed up in his life. Have you ever been or are you currently in a circumstance or a situation that just seems so big and so overwhelming that I can't deal with it on my own? Maybe the series in miracles that we've been doing, and this is week 6, and Craig will finish up with week 7 next week. Maybe the series in miracles has you thinking about ways in which you wish God would show up. Because there's circumstances and suffering and pain that is happening, and you're tried, and this is so overwhelming. But no matter how much you pray, it seems like God is ignoring your pleas. Maybe for some of us, as Pastor Craig talked in week 1, that we simply haven't invited Jesus into our circumstance. Or maybe we have invited Jesus, or don't even know what that exactly looks like. Or maybe we have invited Jesus into the circumstance, but the reality is nothing's changing. That we think we've invited Jesus in, we're asking him to do something, but I feel let down because I'm experiencing something. I can't imagine why God would allow this to happen, and I'm let down because I've tried to invite God in, but he's failed to show up. And because he's failed to show up, there's doubts and there's questions that cause you to think things like, does God really care about me? Is Jesus really real? Is all of this just a hoax? If you've experienced anything like I've talked about in these last few moments, I'm thrilled that you're here this morning. I believe God has brought us here to talk about the doubts and the questions and the overwhelming circumstance and the suffering that we experience in this world, because this is not what God intended. The suffering and the pain that we experience in this world is not how God created it. But yet it's the effects of sin that has been passed down generation after generation after generation. So as we dive into John chapter 9, I also want to remind us that John did not write a gospel with numbers. He didn't write chapters. That's some stuff that we added so we can find certain areas of scripture and follow along with them. But in John chapter 8, right before this, John's gospel lets us know that Jesus started having some pretty intense interactions with the Pharisees. It's really easy for us sitting on this side of history, it's easy for us to look back at the Pharisees and kind of condemn them. And the word Pharisee has almost become a bad word in Christianity. But we have to remember that the Pharisees, they thought they were doing the right thing. That they were established by the law. They were established by the religious order, by the religious culture, to be able to uphold the holy worship of God in the temple. And so they thought they were protecting God's people from being infected by anything of the world, but yet the Pharisees missed some pretty important realities about who Jesus was and the Messiah that was promised to them. And so because of this protection of God's people, and because of this protection of the law, the Pharisees and Jesus, they kind of went at it a few times. And in John chapter 8, there was a lot of disputes. There was dispute about the validity of Jesus' ministry, and there was intense conversation about the validity of Jesus' ministry when he claims that I am the light of this world. There was even dispute about Jesus' deity. The Pharisees and Jesus had this interaction, and they had this conversation about Abraham, and Jesus said, hey, even Abraham longed to see the day that I was to come. And that's when the Pharisees kind of laughed like, oh, you don't get it, do you? You're not even 50 years old, but yet Abraham lived generations ago. And Jesus comes back with a statement, and he says, before Abraham was, I am. And we might look at that and say, well, that's just this way of Jesus saying that he existed before Abraham, which it is. However, the words that Jesus used, that word, I am, was a word that was so holy that even the Jews wouldn't speak it, because that is the name that Yahweh actually gives to himself when he interacts with Moses at the burning bush back in the book of Exodus. It was a holy word. So Jesus was equating himself with Yahweh, which was a big no-no in the Pharisees' day and age. And not only that, he would call God his father, which was unheard of in the first century. So there was a lot of dispute that arose, and even dispute over the spiritual heritage of the Pharisees. So there was already this intense rivalry between Jesus and the Pharisees. And then we find ourselves in John chapter 9. So if you have a Bible, follow along with me in John chapter 9, verse 1. It says, as Jesus, went along, he saw a man that was blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? You see, in the first century, it was thought that maybe if people have physical ailments or disability, it's a cause of somebody's sin, either their own sin or the sin of a generation that has come before them. And in verse 3, Jesus says, "Neither this man nor his parents had sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." And I want to pause right there because that's something that I think we need to really talk about. Because what Jesus is saying, the reason this man is born blind, it's not because anybody has sinned. It's so that the work of God could be displayed in him and through them. What Jesus is saying is there is purpose in his pain, that there is purpose in his suffering. And I think we need to talk about this, and I think we need to wrap our minds around this, because here's the reality. If our belief, if our trust, if our thought is that life in its totality is the moment that we take our first breath when we're born, and we live our life, and the moment when we breathe our last breath and we close our eyes, that's the totality of our existence. If those decades in between are the totality of our existence, then pain and suffering makes absolutely no sense. But yet what Jesus is saying is, instead of gazing at, if we gaze at the world as we see it, if that's what we fix our eyes on, we're going to see no purpose in pain and suffering. And what Jesus is exposing here is, hey, let's not gaze at the life that we have on this earth. Let's glance at it because we need to give it attention. Let's gaze at something else. Let's gaze at the life to come when Jesus returns and he restores creation the way it was intended to be, when he comes and makes all things right and he makes all things new. You see, when we are only seeing life for what we see in front of us, pain and suffering makes absolutely no sense. But when we glance at what we experience and yet we gaze to the world to come, that's when we might be able to see some purpose in the pain and suffering. I have some dear friends of mine, the Hermans, and they've walked through incredible tragedy, and we walked through with them when their 13-year-old daughter died of cancer. And we walked with them when their father died of cancer. And we've been walking with them as the younger sister, Hope's younger sister, Izzy is now laying in Children's Hospital with the same exact cancer that her father and her sister had passed away from. I can look at that and say, it makes no sense to me. And I have no idea why God would allow this kind of pain and suffering. And I don't pretend to believe this is exactly why God would allow something to happen. But because I know this family, and because I know my God, I know that her life on this earth is not limited to what we experience, but yet there is a life to come, and there's purpose in the midst of the pain. And this is what Jesus is saying. The purpose in this man's pain and his blindness and in his suffering and his circumstance is to reveal the power of God that wants to be displayed to this world. And in verse 4, Jesus goes along and he says, "As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of this world." And so Jesus is contrasting light and darkness and the works of man and the works of God. And he claims once again that I am the light of this world. You see, this question of suffering, it's a great question. It's an age-old question. Why would God allow it? And I can imagine the circumstances and situations, whether it's physical, emotional, relational, vocational, whatever it is. I would imagine that there's circumstances happening represented right here in this room that are so big, and it causes us to think, why, God? Why would you allow this? But here's what I love about Jesus. And one of the main things that prompted me to leave Islam, I was born, some of you know my story, I was born in Iran, grew up Muslim, met Jesus through an athletic ministry called Athletes in Action while I was at college at CSU, and now I'm a follower of Jesus. But here's what I love about Jesus. What sets Jesus apart from every other faith system, from every other deity that people worship, every other God that people have made up throughout the course of history, Jesus is the only one that has suffered the way that his people has suffered. That he is a suffering servant, that he is a wounded healer, that Jesus is the only one that identifies with the same suffering that you and I walk through, that every circumstance we experience, he himself has experienced. And yet he is saying, I am the light of this world, and there's a mission to accomplish while I am here. And his ways are not our ways, and we're going to see that here in a moment. Pick up in verse 6. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with saliva, and he put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed, and he came home seeing. And so Jesus does something pretty peculiar. Jesus takes his spit, he spits on the ground, he takes the dust, and he creates this mud paste, and he puts it on the blind man's eyes. Now, it's not to show that Jesus has magic saliva and that Jesus' magic saliva is going to heal blindness, but Jesus is actually setting up something that's pretty important for us to realize. And we're going to talk about this here in a little bit, that the day that this had happened was on the Sabbath. And on the Sabbath day, there was actually a lot of things that were forbidden for people to do. But yet, if you had, for example, if you had a skin issue, if you had something going on with your skin, and a regular part of that treatment was to put ointment or olive oil or something on that skin, that was permitted on the Sabbath because that was a part of your hygiene. That was something you had to do to take care of yourself. However, you couldn't use something that was not a regular use, like a paste or a cream that you didn't use on a regular basis. You wouldn't be able to use that on the Sabbath. And so Jesus very specifically not uses an ointment that this man would typically use. Whether or not he used it, we don't know. But he takes a paste of mud and he puts it on the guy's eyes. And then he tells him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. The pool of Siloam was fresh water source that came into the old city of Jerusalem. It was a natural spring that came into the old city of Jerusalem. And Jews would look at that, and it almost represented the provision of God, that God had given them this place called Jerusalem that belonged to God, and God provided the fresh water for them to be there. And that's the place that Jesus told them, hey, I want you to go wash your eyes in the place that God has provided the fresh water, the place that actually gives us water, which we need water for life. And in obedience, this man goes, and here's the truth. The man's not exactly sure who's putting mud on his eyes. All he hears is this commotion. He may have heard the name Jesus in the midst of the commotion, maybe when the disciples said rabbi, but all he feels is he feels some paste going on his eyes, and someone says, hey, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And maybe out of desperation, maybe out of obedience, we don't know. But he got up, he went, and he washed in that pool, and now he could see. In verse 8, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? That was a key part of his story. That's a key part of who he was, a man who used to sit and beg. Some claimed he was. Others said, no, it only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes open, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus. Now that's important. He didn't say, my Lord. He didn't say, my Savior. He didn't say the Messiah. He said, hey, that guy that everyone keeps murmuring about, the one that keeps ticking off the Pharisees, the one that all the commotion is about, that guy, they call him Jesus. That's the guy who actually told me to go do this. He made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and I washed. So if you're mad that I washed in the pool, don't blame me, blame this guy. I'm just a blind guy who can now see. And I love what he says, that this guy that was a fixture in the community, that people are used to seeing him sitting on the side of the road blind, and they're used to seeing him begging. And they're so astonished, they even deny that it's him. And he's saying, no, it's me. I am that person that used to be begging over there. But yet the man that they called Jesus, you know why I love this? We're going to come back to this here as well. That you don't need a theological degree to be able to tell people what Jesus has done in your life. You don't need to know the whole ramifications of the fact that Jesus has come in the incarnation of God becoming flesh, and that Jesus is fully God and fully man at the exact same time. You don't have to have all the answers to simply say, this was my life before and this is my life after. He wasn't even a follower of Jesus at this point. We'll find that out here in a little bit. But something happened that he couldn't explain, and he knew Jesus had something to do with it. And this is what I love about the works of Jesus, that the works of Jesus don't always make sense to us and others. You see, I would guess that when we're praying in the midst of a circumstance, or we're praying in the midst of suffering, or we're praying in the midst of a situation that keeps taking up our heart and our mind, our emotions, that I bet when we pray, we have a certain outcome in mind. And we consciously pray, God, would you help me? Because this is the outcome that I want. And we consciously pray for this outcome, but we unconsciously expect God to give us a pathway, and that process is going to be familiar to us. And when that pathway or that process doesn't make sense to us, when it's unfamiliar, we immediately think it's ungodly. That we pray for a certain outcome, and yet we're also trying to control the process. And I wonder if through the season of asking and through the season of doubting and through the season of persevering, I wonder what God shows us as we walk through these seasons of our lives. See, the ways of Jesus don't always make sense. And it's okay if you doubt. Hear me say this. It's okay if you doubt. It's okay if you have questions about Jesus. It's okay if everything doesn't seem to make sense to you. May I just invite us to continue to go on the journey with him and keep asking questions and keep considering our doubt and keep seeking those answers, because here's one of the reasons I believe that God allows this suffering and God allows circumstances to happen in our lives. Because Jesus is most oftentimes found in the searching and the seeking rather than the results. That you and I are results-oriented, God is process-oriented. You and I are fixated and focused on what the outcome's gonna be. God is focused on who we're becoming and how we're being formed on the journey to that outcome. And we're gonna see this played out in the life of this man. See, the Pharisees completely misunderstood God. That they were so scared and so afraid of God that anything unfamiliar was ungodly to them. And see, they would engage in these spiritual practices, and one of the practices they'd engage in was this Sabbath worship. But yet they not only pursued these practices or these spiritual disciplines, which hear me say very clearly, spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices and Sabbath and those kinds of things that we engage in our spiritual life are healthy, and we have to engage those things. But those things in themselves don't give us life. Just like miracles point us to Jesus, our spiritual practices must point us right back to Jesus as well. You see, for the Pharisees, this was their mistake. Their mistake wasn't that they observed Sabbath. Their mistake wasn't they observed the law. The mistake was they felt that life and eternal life was found in the practices, and they missed the fact that Jesus, God in flesh, was standing right in front of them. You see, the Sabbath was set up by God. It was a divine covenant set up by God with him and his people, because he knows the way that we are. He knows that we have a tendency to be self-sufficient. And so even God, as he created, and on the seventh day we read the account of Genesis, the poetic account in Genesis of creation, we see on the seventh day God finished his work and rested. And yet he commands us to rest. And I believe, one, yes, we need physical rest, because if we don't rest, if God doesn't ask us to rest, you and I will drive ourselves into the ground because we're self-sufficient and self-reliant. But Sabbath was instituted so that we would be able to take a step back, and yes, we need emotional and physical rest. Absolutely, we need that. That's proven through science that our body needs rest. That's why we go to sleep every single night. But setting a day to rest is something that's healthy for us physically and emotionally, but it also forms us spiritually. Because what Sabbath does, because many of us, and I know how we are, we say, I've got too much to do, I can't take a day of rest. And when we have too much to do, that's the exact moment that we need to take a day, because it's not just for our physical and our emotional rest or help, it's for us to make a spiritual statement. That me taking a day off, God can accomplish more with me taking a day off than I can accomplish with me being self-sufficient. The Sabbath was actually instituted as a weekly reminder of surrender. You see, when an army surrenders to another army, if there's an army that represents this king fighting this army representing this other king, and this army overpowers this army and this army surrenders, it doesn't mean that they're just giving up. It doesn't mean, hey, we're done fighting. I'm going to give up fighting for the rest of my life. No, what would happen is they're simply saying we're relinquishing the authority of this king, and we're now coming in under the authority of your king. Sabbath is the exact same thing. Is we're relinquishing the authority of self-sufficiency and coming under the authority of God's sufficiency. And yet the Pharisees missed it. They thought life was found in Sabbath. And in a way, Sabbath rest is the antidote to greed and selfishness and self-assurance. But the Pharisees were so caught up in observing God's law, they completely missed the fact that God had visited them in flesh through Jesus. And I wonder if this is a danger for us. I wonder if we get so caught up and we think so much about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong and our spiritual practices and our spiritual norms and the things that we do on a daily, and what if we get so caught up in our spiritual disciplines that we forget to follow Jesus? This is exactly where the Pharisees found themselves. So Jesus has this man who was born blind, and not because anybody has sinned, so the works of God can be seen in him and through him, even on the Sabbath day. So Jesus does this on a Sabbath day, because if Sabbath is a way for us to remember that we are to surrender everything to God, that Jesus comes and shows that I'm actually greater than Sabbath rest, that the law is fulfilled in me. So he chooses this specific day to perform this, to set aside the cultural and religious norms so that people would point back to him. So in a way, it's not surprising that Jesus would heal on the Sabbath, because when we're in a place of surrender, Jesus is healing and forming us on a regular basis. And my fear is that today, believers, we've substituted following Jesus for practicing Christian things. And in verse 18, in verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees a man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on his eyes, the man replied, and I washed it, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Basically, he doesn't do it right. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. And the man replied, he is a prophet. Did you catch that? He went from calling him, hey, Jesus, I think people call him Jesus, to saying that actually, I think he's a prophet. And that's what people say about him. So this progression of this man who's been healed, he goes from hearing about this name Jesus to actually now calling him a prophet. And it goes on in verse 18, they still did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one that you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see? We know this is our son, the parents answered. We know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him, he is of age, he'll speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And that's why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. And so they're trying to trap them, and they're trying to trap this man, and they're trying to bring his parents into it. And so they summon his parents, and his parents say, we know this is our son. We know this has happened. We're not entirely sure how this happened. Why don't you ask him? Because he's of age. And we pick up in verse 24. A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. He replied, look, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. Here's what I do know. I was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered, look, I've told you already, and you don't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you guys want to be one of his disciples too? Which was not a good thing for him to say in that time. Then they hurled insults at him and said, you're this fellow's disciple? We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. And the man starts to have a little bit of fun here. The man is, now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from. Like, aren't you guys supposed to have it all together? Aren't you all the religious leaders? Aren't you all supposed to be the ones that are closest to God? How is it you all that are closest to God can't even tell where this man has come from? You don't know where he's come from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. You see, this man started with a lot of doubts about who Jesus was, and he went from a person that was begging on the side of the road, and now he's standing in front of the Pharisees, emboldened and sharing what had happened to him. There's a couple of points I want us to jot down and maybe think about and consider as we walk through this, and some things that I believe are exposed about who Jesus is and what he's looking to do in our lives. You see, the first point is this. The man focused on what he knew, not what he didn't. The man focused on, hey, this is what's happened to me. I was blind, mud went on my face, I went and washed, and now I can see. He focused on what he knew. He didn't focus on what he didn't know. He didn't know the ramifications of everything that was wrapped up in God coming in flesh. He didn't know everything there is to know about Jesus. He probably didn't know the Torah very well, because if he was blind from birth, he probably didn't go to school. He probably didn't memorize the Torah like other kids his age. So he probably was a little ignorant to the ways in which God would interact with his people growing up. But yet he focused on what he knew, not what he didn't. But see, the Pharisees, what did they focus on? They couldn't even tell where this guy came from. They focused on what they didn't know, not what they did know. So this man focused exactly on what had happened, and that builds on to the next point. That because of Jesus, he went from being a blind beggar to an empowered evangelist. Like, he went and stood in front of the religious court, the religious leaders. If he was blind, he wouldn't even be able to come into the temple because of his disability. But yet, because he's healed, he is empowered and he's emboldened, and he stands in front of them, and he's actually challenging and taunting the religious leaders. He went from blind beggar to empowered evangelist because of what Jesus has done. And here's the last point. I want to talk about this point a little bit. That his testimony and your testimony of what God has done in your life is your greatest tool for others to know Jesus. Like, I want us to sit here and think about our stories. I want us to realize and understand that our story is the main apologetic, the main tool that God has given us to display that Jesus is the light of this world. Like, I can tell you this very clearly. In high school and in college, my life was a disaster. Like, it was a mess. I was doing things I shouldn't have been doing. I was going through a lot of emotions. Things were not going well. And then Jesus happened. And then I was discipled in Jesus, and someone walked with me and taught me what it meant to walk like Jesus and lead like Jesus led. And when I encounter people from high school or even in college, and they hear what I do now, they think to themselves, what? Like, you're doing what with your life? Like, don't people do background checks to do the things that you're like doing? And I say, well, sometimes they do, and yet here I am. But here's the cool thing about our stories. And students, if you're a student here, I want you to hear me. Nobody can tell you your story didn't happen. That's why it's such a powerful tool. Like, I believe wholeheartedly, I've studied, I believe that the 4,000 plus original manuscripts of the New Testament that have been found by archaeologists absolutely affirm the validity of the scriptures. The Dead Sea Scrolls absolutely affirm the validity of the Old Testament. But there are people that know philosophy and archaeology, and they say things to me I can't even pronounce. And I say, well, I don't know about that, but here's what I do know. My life was this way, and then Jesus happened, and now my life is this way, and no matter what philosophy or archaeological evidence you provide, you can't tell me that didn't happen in my life. That your greatest tool in sharing the gospel is your story. It's so important that even in Revelation, at the end of the scriptures, we find in the book of Revelation that John, as he sees this picture of heaven, he looks into heaven and he sees that the whole story of God, and he writes it down for us. There's this picture in Revelation chapter 12. And in Revelation chapter 12, he sees basically the story of good and evil, and God and his armies fighting Satan and his armies, and Satan and his army has been hurled down to the earth. And Revelation 12 tells us that he went to go make war with all of God's people. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 11, it's this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful passage that tells us that they, the people of God, triumphed over Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Did you realize that your story and your testimony, what God has done in your life, is such a powerful tool that it can even drive back darkness and evil. And yet sometimes we sit and we think, well, I don't have much of a story to share. If Jesus is involved in your story, you have a story to share, because there's no such thing as a Christian without a testimony. There's no such thing as a Christian without purpose, and there's no such thing as a Christian without mission. And us telling our story and sharing the gospel is so key and so important to who we are. Pastor Craig and I are actually crafting a series that's going to start in a couple of weeks called The Playbook, How to Change the World. And what we're going to center on is our individual stories. How do we share our story of what Jesus has done in our life to be able to share with the people in our community? That our story is so important for us. And in verse 35, as we start to round the corner for this man's journey and this man's story, as he's been seeking and goes from saying, hey, that guy they call Jesus, to I think Jesus is a prophet. Listen to what happens in verse 35. Jesus heard they had thrown him out, and when they found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I might believe in him. So you remember, he hadn't seen who Jesus was. The last interaction, he was still blind. He maybe recognized the voice. And Jesus said, you have seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. The journey of him asking questions, seeking things out, people ask him, considering his journey, led him from calling Jesus, hey, that man that they call Jesus, to calling him Lord, and I believe in you, and he worships him. That Jesus is found in the seeking and the searching, not just the outcome. And Jesus said, for judgment I've come into this world, so the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. In a nutshell, people that don't see me, people who don't believe in me, I have come so that they might see clearly. And those people that think they're wise, those people that think they have it all together, they're actually going to become blind, because they're going to think their life is found in their self-sufficiency and their self-reliance. So this is a beautiful story of a man who journeys from physical blindness to sight. But in reality, it was a symbolism of his transition from spiritual darkness to spiritual light because of the light of the world. I want to speak to a few of us here today. And you might be here today and you might call yourself a believer and a follower of Jesus. And I'm thrilled for that. And I hope you will still continue to seek, and you'll still continue to question, and you'll still continue to search for these answers you might be looking for in your heart. Or maybe you don't believe. Maybe you've made a conscious decision to say, I'm never gonna believe. I don't believe and I won't believe. May I simply invite you to continue to ask questions, to continue to search, even when maybe the ways in which we hope God would show up, even when he doesn't show up, may we continue just going on a journey of discovery, seeing what Jesus would do in our lives and what he would show us, to invite us to go on this journey and this pathway. I remember years ago, it was about 15 years ago, I was in a season of my life that was really difficult and really hard. And there's this hike, if you're familiar with northern Colorado at all, my family and I, we live in Fort Collins. And if you're familiar with northern Colorado, there's a very popular hike. There's a reservoir called Horsetooth Reservoir, and there's a Horsetooth Trail that takes you up to the very top of the mountain. There's this rock called Horsetooth Rock. And when you get up there, you can kind of see the whole horizon. You get to see eastern Colorado, and it's beautiful. And there was a season in my life where I was really searching and just asking God for some things that were going on in me. And I remember I had a friend that said, hey, if you ever want to do that Horsetooth hike, and if you want to see it from a different perspective, go at night. And try to start early in the morning in the summer, and by the time you get up to the top, watch the sunrise over the horizon. And I thought, I want to do that. And so I drove up to the trailhead to the parking lot, got there, it was about 3 a.m, and I put my headlamp on, and I'm starting, and guys, I gotta tell you, and I'll tell you, I'm terrified of the dark. Like, I don't like the dark, especially being out on a trail in the summer, and I'm thinking, I'm gonna get eaten by a mountain lion, a bear, or Bigfoot, something's gonna attack me. And I remember going up this trail, and it was pitch black, and it was dark, and I had my headlamp, and I remember walking, looking all the way up the trail, and I couldn't see a thing. But you know what I could see? I could see a few feet in front of me because of my headlamp. So I just kept walking. And then I heard some rustling in the bushes, and terrified, I look over, and it's this little bunny rabbit that kind of goes over. But in the dark, everything seemed scary. When circumstances are overwhelming, everything seems scary. But yet I took a couple of steps and took a couple of steps, go around the corner and took a couple of steps, and my headlamp kind of illuminated the path in front of me. And I kept walking and I kept walking. And that went on for about an hour and 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours. And I finally get up to the top. And I'm sitting up there, and the sun is starting to come up, and everything's starting to light up. And I swear I saw Kansas over there in the horizon, and the sun coming up over Kansas and the sunrise. And it was beautiful. And you know what? Thinking back to that, you know what I realized? That I wouldn't have been able to see that beautiful sunrise over Kansas or the horizon. I wouldn't have been able to see that if I was at the bottom. That I had to go on a journey. And I had to go on that journey step by step by step. And when I got to the top of the rock, my position was different than when I started. And because my position was different, my perspective had changed. And I was actually able to see the trail. I was able to see my car. I was able to experience everything that I just walked through because my position was different. And friends, I wonder what it would look like for us to realize, what does it mean for us to change our position? To move from a position of self-sufficiency on our feet, that we are self-reliant, that we can figure everything out, that this is exactly how God's gonna work, and I'm gonna ask God to work in a way, and this is the pathway in which, and the process that God's gonna take to give me the outcome I want. But I wonder if the position of being confidently on our feet, if we simply change our position and move to our knees. Because when you're on your knees, your position is different. And when you're on your knees, this is a position of surrender. Remember, surrendering isn't giving up when you're going through circumstances. Surrender is relinquishing authority. And I wonder if the position some of us need to take is moving from our feet of confidence to our knees in surrender. Coming before God as a statement saying, I relinquish my authority. However you want to do, whatever you want to do, Jesus, I surrender to you. And I wonder if some of us need to be in this place. We recognize that we can't be self-sufficient any longer, that we are to live a life that is surrendered. You see, I think that this passage really isn't about blindness. It's not about sight, although that's a really important part. This passage isn't about the Sabbath, although it's a pretty important part because Jesus shows that he's greater than the Sabbath. This passage is all about Jesus moving us from spiritual darkness to spiritual light. That we can't see things clearly on this side of eternity. And we get so caught up in the things of gazing at things in this world that we even forget to gaze to the life to come. This passage is all about moving from spiritual blindness, spiritual darkness, to spiritual light because of the light of the world. Would you pray with me? Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you that we are here in this place. And God, I pray for a continued spirit of surrender. That Lord, that we would not try to control the way that you would work in our lives, but we would live lives knowing that you have given us a great opportunity and tool to let the world know of this hope that we have in us, and that is our story. So I thank you for the example of this man who searched and was asked questions and considered and thought and moved from not even knowing what your name was to calling you Lord, and he believes and worships. And I pray that the hearts that are represented here today, Father, that we also would move from a place of self-sufficiency as we ask questions, as we consider, as we doubt, as we go on the journey of life. The Lord, that you would change our position and we would have great eternal perspective of who you are and what you do in our lives. So Lord, we surrender ourselves to you. In your name, amen.